The atmosphere trembled as the last shuttle pulled away, engines flaring like dying stars against the muted teal of the planet's sky. Dust swirled where its landing struts had scorched the dry crust, and for a long moment, silence reigned across the rocky basin. Then the cadets began to move, hesitantly at first, then frantically, like ants discovering they'd been left behind. 17 species, 32 cadets, all scattered in clusters across the terrain. Some stood frozen in disbelief, blinking under unfamiliar sunlight filtered through the twin moon's pale reflections. Others began arguing in their native tongues, frustrated gestures and rapid breathing, revealing what none wanted to admit. There were no supplies, no crates dropped, no instructions, no signal. Jackson Reeves stood alone, his boots pressed into the powdered surface, taking it all in. The environment was harsh, but not hostile, at least not on the surface. The sky shimmered with particles suggesting moderate radiation, and the wind carried an odd chemical sting that hinted at corrosive compounds. The ground underfoot was a mosaic of fragmented stone and fibrous moss that crunched softly when stepped on. He bent down, ran his gloved fingers along the texture, and sniffed. Sulfuric base, probably acidic if broken open. He made a mental note. Others weren't so composed. A tall Oscar female, her scales reflecting pale orange light, roared something guttural to a panicked group of smaller Carillion twins, each no larger than Jackson's waist. A Drexy male with broad segmented arms slammed his fists into the rock and let out a metallic-sounding cry of frustration. 2 Glinton cadets already sat down in the dirt, their iridescent fins drooping in defeat. They expected rations, shelter, weapons, at least instructions. They expected civilization. Jackson never did. He knew this wasn't a simulation. It wasn't a clean, neatly staged scenario with a protocol and a failsafe. This was the final trial of the Galactic Unity Academy, where cadets from across the Orion Arm were trained not just in tactics, culture, and science, but survival. And survival, he'd learned, didn't come in boxes with blinking lights. It came when you understood that nothing was coming to save you. He turned away from the others and began to walk. No one called after him. Not yet. He didn't expect them to. Humans were still seen as something of a novelty, fragile, underdeveloped, a species that barely scraped its way into the galactic fold. Even now, the term Death Worlder was used more as a joke than a title. Jackson didn't mind. Let them underestimate him. The basin was wide, bordered by jagged ridgelines that cast long shadows across the uneven ground. He ascended one of the outcroppings, eyes scanning for water lines, moss density, mineral sheens, anything that indicated where life clung strongest. That's where he would begin. Behind him, shouting escalated. Cadets argued about splitting up, about staying put, about setting up a distress signal. Jackson could have told them there wouldn't be any response. The comms were cut the moment the shuttle reached orbit, and this moon had no satellites, no beacons. That was the point. The instructors wanted them desperate, isolated, tested. He descended into a crevice where the wind seemed gentler. The rock here was smoother, protected by curvature, and thin vines with translucent bulbs clung to the sides. Carefully, he plucked one bulb and pressed it between his gloves. It didn't burst. Good sign. He cracked the shell, watched as clear liquid trickled down, and touched it to his tongue. Sour, acidic, but not poisonous. He smiled. It wasn't much, but it was moisture. With enough of these, he could stay hydrated, maybe boil them if he found suitable materials. He pocketed a few bulbs and began marking the wall with small scratches, counting his steps, plotting the way back. Orientation was everything in alien environments, especially for someone alone. An hour passed before he heard footsteps behind him. He didn't turn immediately. The cadence was light, someone small, or at least cautious. When he finally looked back, he saw a Nentari female approaching. Her eyes were large and reflective, set deep in a soft blue face. Her 4 fingers twitched nervously against her chest, and her breathing was shallow. "Did you find anything?" she asked, voice filtered through her translator. Jackson nodded but said nothing. She stepped closer. "Some of them think there was a mistake, that the Academy forgot to drop the equipment." He looked around the empty expanse. "Does this look like a mistake to you?" She hesitated, then shook her head. "I thought not," he said. "What's your name?" "Vela." "All right, Vela, you can follow me, but no questions for now. I need to focus." She nodded and stepped quietly behind him. others would come soon. He could feel it, not because he was leading, but because desperation made eyes sharp. They'd see the two of them vanishing into the ridges and wonder what they'd found. And when those cadets realized there really were no deliveries, no artificial shelters, no hidden caches, they'd start watching. By the time Jackson returned to the drop site at sunset, 4 others had gathered near the small rock pile he'd built. A marker, not a camp. A Glintan male was chewing something bitter and grimacing. A Drexy female stood with her arms crossed, silent but alert. A pair of Oscar twins crouched nearby, whispering in low clicks. Jackson stood before them and held up a smooth, flat stone. "This is how it starts," he said. "Not with weapons, not with rations. With thinking, observing, using what's here." He dropped the stone, then held up the cracked bulb from earlier. "You want to survive? Learn what this place gives you. Then teach others." He didn't wait for applause. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He sat down by the marker and began carving again, sketching the terrain into the stone with a broken mineral shard, planning routes, dangers, and possibilities. The others remained silent, but none walked away. That night, beneath a sky dotted with unfamiliar stars, a small circle of cadets formed around him. They weren't a team yet. They weren't even allies. But they were beginning to realize something crucial. The human wasn't waiting for help. He was building from nothing. And maybe, just maybe, they could too. The night deepened across the ridged horizon, spreading cold like a silent predator. The sky above shimmered with ribbons of ionized gas, casting ghostly light down onto the makeshift basin where the cadets had loosely gathered. Jackson crouched over his carved stone map, feeling the temperature fall rapidly with every breath. His fingers, though gloved, began to stiffen as frost crusted the edge of the rocks beside him. He didn't speak. He didn't complain. But he knew. If the others didn't find heat soon, this moon would claim its first casualties before dawn. Vela sat a few meters away, curled up in the cloak-like membrane she had unfolded from beneath her tunic. Her species had no concept of fire. She hadn't grown up in an environment that required it. She watched Jackson intently, her reflective eyes picking up the smallest movements as he sorted through fragments of local vegetation and stone. The others had already retreated into small cracks and overhangs, clutching their arms and hoping for a miracle. Jackson didn't believe in miracles. He believed in combustion. He pulled a cluster of fibrous moss from his pouch, harvested earlier near the crevice where he had first tasted the bulb water. The moss had potential. It was light, dry, and flaked when rubbed between his hands. Good tinder. He set it aside and unrolled a bundle of vine bark he had stripped earlier, using it to form a crude bowl. Then came the centerpiece, the drill. He had carved the spindle using a narrow shard of black crystal, shaping the point with obsessive care. The drill base was a flat slice of bark, reinforced with a mineral ring, and the bow was nothing more than a bent reed with a sinew string made from stripped plant threads. It was primitive, ugly, and it would work. Vela tilted her head slightly. "What is that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jackson didn't look up. "Firemaker." She stared at the setup, confusion slowly transforming into curiosity. "You believe you can summon fire from plants and dust?" "I don't believe," he said calmly, locking the spindle into place. "I know." He braced the drill under his boot, anchored the socket stone above it, and pulled the bow with quick, steady strokes. The spindle began to turn, slowly at first, then faster. Smoke curled upward from the base as friction built. A small hiss of wind blew past, but Jackson hunched over the bundle, shielding it with his body. He worked without pause, arms pumping in rhythm. His breath clouded in front of him, eyes focused, jaw tight. A faint glow began to pulse from the tinder, hidden in the dark fluff. He stopped suddenly, leaned in, and whispered into the fibers. Not a word, just a stream of warm air. Encouragement. A spark caught. A tiny flame licked upward, blue at first, then orange. Jackson fed it with shredded bark, then wrapped the moss gently around it. The glow grew, and he placed it inside a shallow depression in the stone, surrounding it with dry sticks coated in crystallized resin. The fire crackled into life. Vela blinked, her mouth parting in silent astonishment. For a few seconds, neither of them moved. Then the heat reached her, brushing her skin like a forgotten memory. She stood and took a single step closer. "How did you—" she began. Jackson sat back, wiping sweat from his brow. Friction, oxygen, fuel. He didn't offer further explanation. He didn't need to. The others began to emerge from the shadows, drawn by the light. The Drexy female approached first, her armor-like skin etched with frost. She looked down at the fire, then at Jackson, but said nothing. Behind her, the Glintan male stood awkwardly, arms tucked to his sides, clearly uncomfortable in the cold. Jackson looked around at them. "You're here now. You want warmth. You help feed it." The Drexy female crouched and extended a segmented arm toward the flame. "You made this?" she asked, her voice metallic. He nodded. "Yes." She glanced at the others, then back at him. "Teach me." That was how it began. By the time the second fire was lit, 5 cadets were watching. Jackson had them gather materials, moss, bark, vine string. He corrected their angles, adjusted pressure, and demonstrated again, always letting them fail before showing them how to succeed. He wasn't interested in being the hero. He was interested in building memory into muscle, instinct into survival. The Drexy female, who later introduced herself as Reka, was the first to succeed on her own. She let out a triumphant growl as her flame caught, then looked to Jackson for approval. He simply nodded and said, "Good, make another." Vela took longer. Her delicate hands struggled with the bow, and her grip slipped often. But she never gave up. When her first ember caught, she nearly dropped it in shock. Jackson grabbed her wrist, steadied her, and moved her hands to where the flame needed to go. She followed his guidance silently, then watched in awe as the fire grew. More cadets arrived with each passing hour. By midnight, 4 fires burned around the basin, each one encircled by aliens who had never seen open flame before. Some stared in awe, others huddled close, soaking in the warmth. For the first time since landing, the camp stopped shivering. Jackson didn't rest. He moved between circles, correcting techniques, showing how to bank coals, how to shield flames from wind using rock formations. He taught by example, never lecturing, only doing. He had long since learned that most cadets wouldn't listen to instructions, but all of them would copy what worked. The Oscar twins returned, one of them carrying a bundle of dry thorns. Jackson took it, snapped one branch in half, and showed how it sparked slightly when rubbed against the rock. A new fire-making method. Not better, just different. He added it to the growing list of resources. By dawn, 12 cadets had built their own fires. No one was talking about distress signals anymore. The others didn't see Jackson as a leader, not yet. But they circled closer to his campfire, watched him more carefully, whispered about how his species had come from a planet that burned, how his kind had learned to shape metal from fire and light from heat. He ignored the whispers. Instead, he sat by the largest fire and held his hands over the flames, palms open. He wasn't basking in it. He was thinking. Heat was just the beginning. Tomorrow they'd need tools. They'd need storage. They'd need order. And if no one else stepped up, he would show them how to build that too. But for now, the fire was enough. It had begun with sparks, yes, but what mattered most was what followed after, because in every cadet's eyes, in every flame they now sat beside, Jackson could see something new taking root, not just warmth, trust. The morning light crawled over the ridge in pale yellow streaks, dissolving the frost still clinging to the rocks. Steam rose from the damp ground where the fires had burned through the night. Jackson sat by a smoldering pit, sharpening a piece of crystalline rock against the edge of another, his focus absolute. He no longer needed to look around to know others were nearby. He could hear soft footsteps, the occasional cough, and the deliberate silence of cadets who had learned that noise wasted energy. Reka approached him first, her segmented arms folded behind her back. She held a flat sheet of plant fiber, hardened by heat and resin. "Is this strong enough?" she asked, offering it to him without ceremony. He took it and flexed the piece gently between his palms. The fibers groaned under tension but held firm. He nodded. "Strong enough for binding, maybe not for armor." Reka grunted. "Didn't ask for armor, asked to carry meat." "You're thinking ahead," he said. "Good." She sat beside him without invitation, her weight making a dull impact against the stone. Jackson reached for a length of vine and began to braid it with a precise rhythm, threading the hardened sheet into its center. The others slowly gathered. Vela was among them, holding 2 long rods of pale blue wood she had scavenged from deeper in the valley. She didn't speak, but held them upright for him to examine. He tapped one of the rods with a stone shard. A dull tone, dense, but not brittle. "Excellent." He pointed toward the fire pit. "Soften the ends in steam, then taper them with this," he said, offering her a triangular stone blade. "You're making spear shafts." She blinked once, then turned to obey without a word. He didn't need followers. He needed contributors. And by now, those who stayed had begun to understand the difference. He taught each cadet only what they were ready to handle, not to hoard knowledge, but to avoid overwhelm. The camp wasn't built on strength or rank. It was built on momentum. Within hours, the ground was littered with fragments, failed blades, snapped twine, misshapen hooks, but also with success. Jackson crafted the first complete spear before midday. Its head was a razor of compressed glassy crystal, bonded to the shaft with sap, resin, and tight vine twine. He tested its balance by spinning it slowly on his palm, then driving it into the ground with a clean motion. Several cadets applauded lightly. He ignored it. "Next," he said, stepping aside so Vela could attempt hers. Her hands were steadier now. She tied off her spearhead, applied the resin, and angled the shaft correctly. Jackson made only one correction, tightening the bottom wrap to adjust torque. When she raised her weapon to the light, her eyes flickered with something unfamiliar. Pride. The hunt began before sunset. Reka, Vela, and a young Eskin male named Turok volunteered to accompany Jackson into the nearby thickets where movement had been seen earlier. The creatures were small, quick, and had eyes positioned high on their heads. Jackson assumed they were herbivores, possibly scavengers, but they had meat on them, and that was what mattered. He led the group in silence, teaching as they walked. How to step without noise, how to feel the wind, how to recognize scat or bent vegetation. Turok was impatient. He kept glancing skyward, expecting drones or surveillance satellites. "There's no one watching," Jackson muttered. Turok stiffened. "What if we get lost?" Jackson stopped and pointed behind them. "Follow your own footprints. If you can't do that, you don't belong here." Turok looked away, but said nothing more. They found the first trail near a muddy indentation shaped like a crescent. The creature that made it dragged one leg, injured, perhaps. Jackson gestured for silence and motioned for the others to fan out. Reka moved like a whisper. Vela crouched low, copying Jackson's stance. Turok hovered in the back, his spear clutched too tightly. The kill was quick. Jackson spotted the creature first, a round-bodied mammal-like thing with 6 legs and a twitching nose. It sniffed at a cluster of fruit pods, unaware of the danger. He signaled. Reka moved in from the side while Vela crept up behind it. Jackson waited until the beast raised its head. Then he threw. The spear struck cleanly, piercing its side with a wet crunch. It thrashed, tried to run, then collapsed. Reka moved in to secure it. Vela stood frozen, her face pale but her hands steady. Jackson walked up, retrieved his spear, and checked the wound. "Meat's fresh," he said. "Intestines intact. Good kill." Vela knelt beside it, eyes fixed on the blood seeping into the soil. "This is real," she said quietly. "Yes," he replied. "You're feeding the camp now." Back at the fires, the smell of cooking meat drew cadets like moths. Many had never smelled it before, let alone tasted it. Jackson showed Reka how to skin and gut the animal, how to drain the blood properly and avoid rupturing organs. Vela took notes in her native script, etching on bark slates using the hot end of a twig. He distributed the first cuts evenly. No one received more than anyone else, not even himself. Turok grumbled but accepted his share. Jackson noticed his grip on the spear had loosened since returning. He would learn, eventually. The rest of the night was spent turning waste into resource. Jackson scraped the hide and stretched it to dry. Reka turned bones into fishhooks. Vela experimented with the creature's bile to see if it could soften fibers. She gagged once but kept going. By morning, Jackson had a toolkit, 2 spears, 1 skin, 5 knives, a drying rack made of braided reed and bent wood, hooks, cord, a single coil of sinew rope. No item wasted, no effort repeated unnecessarily. He knew what came next. Organization. He called for a circle, not of command, but of knowledge. He invited each cadet to bring something they had made or learned. Some brought tools, others brought mistakes. One young Thren girl showed a cooking pit she had dug and reinforced using water-hardened mud. Another cadet shared how his species' saliva could dissolve resin for reuse. Jackson said little. He let the knowledge circulate freely. His role was not to gatekeep. It was to keep the spark alive. When the sun reached its zenith, Reka placed her hand on Jackson's shoulder. "Your kind has done this before," she said. He glanced at her, one brow raised. What? Started from nothing, she continued. Built worlds, made fire, hunted, organized. He nodded slowly. Every species has. Ours just remembers. She looked at the tools, the drying racks, the fires, the food. Then she looked at the others, some sitting, some building, none afraid. This feels like the beginning of something, she said. Jackson didn't answer. He didn't need to, because beginnings weren't proclaimed. They were built, and he was still building. The wind shifted 2 days later, carrying with it a subtle vibration that resonated through the rocks. Jackson noticed it first, crouching low and pressing his ear to the ground. A faint hum pulsed in intervals, steady as a heartbeat. He knew that rhythm, radiation storms. He had experienced them on barren test sites back on Earth, though never on a scale like this. The air itself felt heavier, charged with particles that prickled against the skin. If the cadets stayed exposed, the storm would not just burn them, it would strip them down to bone. He rose quickly and scanned the horizon. Thin lines of violet light were forming above the ridges, bleeding across the sky like cracks in glass. The storm was building fast. Around him, cadets were restless, uncertain of the change. Some covered their heads with scraps of hide. Others pressed close to the fires as if heat alone could protect them. Vela's eyes caught his, wide and shimmering, silently asking what he already knew. What now? Shelter, he said firmly. We need cover. The others looked at him, waiting for instructions. He wasted no time. He sprinted toward the slope where he had once seen caves outlined by shadow. Reka followed without hesitation, her massive frame moving with surprising agility. Vela and Turok trailed close behind, with others stumbling after, unwilling to admit their fear, but drawn by survival. At the ridge, Jackson inspected the first opening. Too shallow. The storm's radiation would cut through it in minutes. He pressed deeper into the cliffs, running his hand along the stone, knocking it with shards to test density. He found a section where the rock resonated less, thicker, and more compact. That was where he began. Here, he ordered, start digging. The cadets hesitated. No one wanted to strike solid rock with bare hands. Jackson picked up a sharpened bone and drove it into the surface, cracking off a chunk of stone. The echo carried, deep and hollow. A pocket lay inside. Encouraged, Reka pushed forward with her segmented arms, breaking apart fragments with sheer force. Jackson guided her, pointing out the weaker spots. Soon, others joined. Vela used her slender fingers to pry out the loose edges, while Turok swung a crude hammerstone with reckless energy, sending sparks into the air. Dust filled their lungs, coating tongues with bitter grit, but the work pressed on. Hours passed. The sky above grew darker, streaked with luminous waves that hissed and crackled. The hum in the rocks became a roar. The storm was nearly upon them. Jackson forced them harder, faster. He dug until his knuckles bled, until the air stung his throat, until the cavern widened enough to fit 10 cadets shoulder to shoulder. Reka cleared the ceiling beams, stabilizing them with cross-hatch slabs reinforced by vine cords. Vela layered resin along cracks, sealing them against leaks. Even the smallest cadets found tasks, carrying stones or weaving mats to cover the floor. By the time the first arcs of violet lightning split the sky, the shelter stood. The cadets poured inside, clutching one another in silence. The storm hit the ridge with a deafening roar, rattling stone and shaking dust loose from the ceiling. The outside world glowed in waves of violet and white, painting shadows that danced across the cavern walls. Sparks of energy hissed against the rock, as if the storm itself clawed to get in. Jackson stood at the entrance, one arm braced against the wall, watching as the radiation battered the stone. His skin prickled even at the edge. He pulled back and rolled a slab into place, sealing the entrance with vines and mud. The world outside vanished, leaving only the glow of torches flickering inside. For the first time since arriving on this moon, silence fell without fear. The cadets were safe, at least for now. The cavern became more than shelter. It became a school. Jackson didn't plan it, but once the storm forced them into confinement, instruction became inevitable. He picked up a shard of charcoal from the torch and began drawing on the walls. Rough sketches of fire bows, spear shafts, pit traps, and knots appeared beneath his hand. Each stroke was deliberate, each line accompanied by explanation. He spoke simply, but with authority, making sure every cadet understood. Reka demonstrated how her strength could split thick rock slabs, then showed others how to stack them for structural support. Vela illustrated the use of plant fibers for insulation, carefully weaving samples into layers to block radiation pockets. Turok, though impatient, showed surprising accuracy in shaping blades when given proper guidance. One by one, each cadet shared what he or she had mastered. The cave became a circle of knowledge. Every firelight session, another step forward. Jackson noticed the shift. No longer were the cadets staring at him alone for answers. They were looking at one another, asking, sharing, correcting. Species who had never trusted each other before were sitting side by side, sketching knots into stone dust, debating how best to shape spearheads or reinforce bindings. The Academy's trial had been designed to isolate, but here, isolation had transformed into cooperation. At night, when the storm outside raged like a living beast, Jackson sat apart, sharpening a blade. Vela approached quietly and lowered herself beside him. She watched the sparks from his stone strike. For a long time, she said nothing. Then softly she asked, "Why do you give away everything you know?" He glanced at her. "What use is knowledge if I hoard it? You won't survive because of me. You'll survive because you've learned." Her reflective eyes softened. "But you could keep power. Others would follow you." He shook his head. "Power fades. Skills don't." She fell silent again, staring into the torchlight, the faintest hint of admiration shaping her expression. The storm lasted 3 days. 3 endless cycles of violet light and earth-shaking roars, each one pounding against the cavern walls. But inside, the cadets built more than shelter. They built trust. They practiced tool-making, improved hunting designs, experimented with insulation techniques. By the time the sky outside cleared, the cavern walls were covered in charcoal diagrams, reminders of what had been learned. When Jackson finally rolled the stone from the entrance and stepped outside, the air was crisp, the horizon washed clean. Behind him, cadets poured out, shielding their eyes from the sudden brilliance. Some carried tools they had crafted. Others carried sketches copied onto bark slates. All carried something new in their posture, confidence. The storm had not broken them. It had forced them together. Reka stepped forward and placed her segmented arm across Jackson's shoulder. "You gave us fire," she said. "You gave us tools. And now, you gave us a place to remember." Jackson looked at the cavern one last time. The shelter would remain. Even if storms returned, it would stand. But more importantly, the cadets had learned to build, to reinforce, to share. That knowledge couldn't be erased. He adjusted the strap of his hide satchel, his blade secured against his hip. "Storm's over," he said. "Time to move forward." The group followed him down the slope, their torches extinguished, their footsteps stronger than before. Behind them, the cavern glowed faintly with the last embers of firelight, a monument to the night they stopped being survivors and started becoming builders. And for Jackson, it was proof of something larger, that survival was never just about enduring. It was about creating. And creation had only just begun. The storm's aftermath left the land quiet, almost reverent, as if the violent skies had burned away every trace of weakness. The horizon stretched clean, revealing ridges scarred by lightning, forests stripped bare, and valleys filled with steaming pools. The cadets moved through it with steady steps, no longer wandering in panic, no longer asking what would come next. They carried tools, hides, bundles of dried meat, even sketches carved onto bark plates. Jackson walked at the front, not as a commander, but as a marker of direction. Those who followed did so willingly, because each of them had built something in the days behind the stone walls, and now each of them wanted to see how far that work could go. By the time the suns dipped behind the ridges, the group reached a flat plain dotted with crystalline outcroppings that sparkled in the twilight. Jackson slowed his pace and let his gaze sweep the land. This was different from the basin where they had first landed. Open ground, wide enough to see an enemy approach, rich in resources scattered across its edges. He stopped in the center and dropped his satchel. The sound echoed across the plain, and the others instinctively gathered around him. "Here," he said simply, "we build." There was no argument, not anymore. Work began immediately. Reka drove her arms into the ground, breaking apart slabs of earth to form foundation pits. Vela coordinated smaller cadets, weaving reeds into mats for roofing. Turok shaped spearheads with methodical strikes, his earlier impatience burned away by necessity. Even those who had once stood frozen now found their hands occupied, guided not by Jackson's direct instruction, but by habits the group had developed together. Each task flowed into another, Like pieces of a single design, none of them had planned, yet all of them understood. Fires were lit in the center, sending warm plumes of smoke skyward. Around the fires, shelters rose, some simple lean-tos, others half-buried dens reinforced with stone. Jackson oversaw without commanding, stepping in only when something threatened to collapse or crack. He taught how to brace beams with crossed supports, how to pack soil to block wind, how to tie knots that would hold even in rain. He never claimed the work as his. He pointed, he demonstrated, then he moved aside, letting others complete the structure. The village was theirs, not his. As night fell, the shelters stood glowing with internal firelight. Smoke curled from openings cut into the walls, and the air carried the smell of roasting meat mixed with resin and moss. Cadets from 17 species sat together in a circle around the largest fire, the sound of voices blending into a single rhythm. Some sang in tones unfamiliar, deep and resonant. Others told stories, imitating Jackson's earlier wall drawings with gestures and words. The trial had been meant to strip them down to nothing, yet here they sat, surrounded by tools, food, and community. Jackson remained at the edge of the firelight, sharpening a blade across stone. He watched the circle without joining it, listening to laughter that had not existed in those first nights. He had built nothing alone. He had only shown them how to begin. What they carried forward belonged to them now. When the extraction ships descended the following morning, the village did not scatter in fear. The cadets stood at the edge of their shelters, spears in hand, fires burning high, smoke curling as a signal that they had endured. The ships landed with a low thrum, sending ripples across the plain. The academy instructors stepped out, armored and stern, expecting to see desperation, ruin, perhaps corpses. Instead, they saw walls of stone, roofs of reed, and cadets who looked less like students and more like settlers. One instructor demanded to know what had happened, his voice sharp with disbelief. This was meant to test individuals, not form a colony. Jackson stepped forward, his face calm but unyielding. "You tested if we could survive alone. I proved we could thrive together." The instructor sneered. "You broke protocol." Jackson lifted his spear and planted it firmly into the ground between them. "No, I broke nothing. You dropped us with nothing. I taught us to make everything. That is survival. That is the lesson." Behind him, the cadets stood silent, unified. 17 species once divided by distrust, now sharing one village, one fire, one memory of endurance. None spoke, but none stepped away from him either. The instructors had their answer, even if they refused to acknowledge it. The ships prepared for departure, calling the cadets back to the academy. Some hesitated. Reka stood at the threshold of her shelter, one hand braced against its wall, reluctant to leave. Vela lingered beside the fire, her eyes reflecting flames she had learned to build herself. Jackson noticed but said nothing. This place would remain long after they left. The village was carved into the stone, into the memory of every cadet who had lived through the storm, who had eaten from the same fire, who had learned that survival was not isolation, but creation. When the last cadet boarded, Jackson walked to the fire. He crouched, reached out, and stirred the embers until flames rose once more. He stood in silence for a long moment, the heat warming his face, then turned his back and walked toward the waiting ramp. As the hatch closed, he looked once over his shoulder at the smoke rising from the plain. The village would vanish in time, consumed by storms and silence. But what had been built here would not vanish from memory. Each cadet would carry the fire forward into every mission, every world, every trial yet to come. That was the true graduation, not the academy's ceremony, not the ranks or the titles, but the understanding that survival meant teaching others how to build, how to endure, how to create. The ship lifted, engines burning against the pale sky. The cadets sat quietly in the hold, tools strapped to their belts, hides across their shoulders, each lost in thought. No one looked at Jackson directly, but every glance toward him carried the same silent acknowledgement. He had not led them by order, he had led them by example, and in doing so, he had changed the meaning of the trial forever. Jackson leaned back against the cold wall of the ship, his hands folded across his chest, his eyes closed, not in exhaustion, but in quiet certainty. The academy could test, judge, and argue, but nothing could erase what had been built on that barren moon. The cadets had been left with nothing. He had taught them to make everything. And in that firelit village, In those shared nights of creation, they had found not just survival, they had found a future.